Hi, my name is Victor Glass. This short course focuses on a hotly debated policy issue: how to achieve universal broadband service in America. The question itself presupposes that the United States does have a problem with the availability and adoption rates for broadband services. And the how-to also suggests that there are solutions to the problem. We'll discuss both assumptions during the course. Before I explore this question in detail, I want to tell you a little bit about my style of presenting material. As with any teacher, I'll try to be organized and informative. But besides that, I want to focus on the lighter side of the debate, the human comedy associated with it. And the reason is that for decades, I've heard many intelligent people say that the telecommunications industry is not fulfilling its obligations. They've predicted all sorts of bad consequences of government inactivity or wrong-headed policies, and they've offered solutions to the problem, and in fact, detailed plans, and some of them have been adopted. And why do I call it a human comedy? Because almost all of these plans that people submitted, and some of them were accepted, were wrong. The people who submitted these plans didn't really understand the industry and couldn't foresee the changes that did occur in the industry. Now, having said that, I believe that I was one of the few people in the industry that did actually understand what was going on and was able to predict some of the changes in the market. However, not everybody agreed with me. In fact, at work, people have been relatively skeptical of some of my opinions, although they've started to see the wisdom of my ideas. However, from your perspective, since I think I know what's going on, and so many other people thought they knew what was going on, you might want to listen to my recommendations with a little bit of skepticism. So let's begin the series of lectures. There are 5 lectures, and they're broken into sections, and section 1 just outlines the broadband debate. I'll talk about some of the basic issues and objectives, the parties involved in the debate, and their perceptions. So, if we want to develop a coherent policy, we need to answer a few basic questions. For example, we have to define our terms. What is the definition of universal broadband service? Second, where are we now? If you have a standard, how are we doing? Third, how do we reach the goal? And associated with that is why is this goal important? It'll turn out the answers to each question is controversial. The objectives of these lectures is to help you understand market developments, regulatory history, and proposals for change, and for you to develop informed opinions. Beyond that, I want to help you develop a framework for evaluating other policy issues, because the broadband debate is really a microcosm of the fiscal debates going on in Washington. For example, what is the role of government? What type of regulation we need? Who pays and how much for government programs? So let's begin with the first question, the definition of universal broadband service. And my point is, it's not at all clear. Technological change has complicated the definition of universal service. Before the packet revolution, that is, for those who don't know what a packet is, think about it as the internet. Before the internet revolution, The service that was associated with universal service was easy to define. It was just simply voice service. And it turns out that it was relatively straightforward to discuss and develop policies because people wanted to have high quality voice service where there wasn't a distortion in what you heard. You had a private connection, calls weren't dropped. And that was the key idea was that everybody should have voice service. Now, a broadband service, when we get to packet technology, high speed internet, or whatever you want to call it, is defined by three dimensions that were kind of bundled up with voice service. It's defined by speed, up speed and download speed, let's say from the internet, security, and the quality of transmission. Is it jumpy? Are you getting distortions or not? And as opposed to voice, let's say voice was at a certain speed, the security was high, and the quality of transmission was as best as could be. Not all people want that kind of service for broadband. So the other issue is in the definition is that customer behavior has changed as well. Broadband demand patterns are a moving target. It's not like voice service. People want more speed, they want more security, they want better quality transmission. And this is all driven by rapidly evolving applications that you can receive, let's say, through the internet, mixes of voice, data, and video. Next question is, how do we reach the goal? Transitions come into play. The availability depends on legacy networks. For example, if you have an old network, you may not be able to provide broadband services. There are some areas where you have to build out, where there isn't any broadband transmission available. And sometimes when you talk about legacy services, you have to talk about replacing old networks. And that takes time. And the other is that adoption depends on customer acceptance and the availability of computers in the home. Well, some people are afraid of computers, and they don't want computers. So they either you need to re-educate them to show them the value of it, or you have to accept that they don't want broadband services. Transitions also are related to concerns about national security, terrorist threats, and natural disasters. They may affect the speed of the transition, the type of intelligence in the networks required by government. Now, why is universal broadband service a public issue? Broadband is linked to economic goals. Now, remember, one of the questions was, where are we? Well, national policymakers perceive that we have our national performance in making broadband available and in adoption rates is relatively poor. We rank well below number one in both wireline and wireless broadband services compared to other nations. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is whether that's a problem or not. I remember years ago when the Soviet Union was still in existence, and the policymakers were worried that the United States was lagging behind the Soviet Union in the production of steel. Was it important? Probably not. Do a thought experiment. Suppose the United States was number one in broadband availability 5 or 10 years ago. Perhaps that means that the United States had invested in a certain type of technology, and it may very well be out of date right now, and being number one 5 years ago may imply that you're going to lag in the future. So, but the point is that people think that because on certain international rankings we're not doing well, that means that we're going to fall behind in the next generation economy. Now, besides international comparisons, there's perceived market failures associated with availability and adoption here in the United States. There are many studies on digital divides between rural and urban customers, rich and poor customers, and they do exist. The question is, how important are they? Then there are also perceived pockets of monopoly power by network providers. They control the lines going to customers, by application providers, the types of services that you can get over the internet or on wireless phones, and content providers, the ones who, let's say, control videos, especially high quality movies. Besides the question about why is it important to have universal broadband service from an economic perspective, broadband is also linked to social goals. For example, equality. Now, I'll focus on, there are two basic values of the United States: freedom or liberty and equality. And in a lot of ways, a definition of equality can be mapped to a definition of freedom. So I'll focus on equality for this very simple reason. Equality has the sense of sameness, treating everybody alike, whereas freedom has the sense of drawing out the distinctiveness among people. So I'll just focus on equality. Well, from a lot of perspectives, uh, uh, universal broadband services is associated with equality. Equality before the law, fair rules fairly applied. You want all the network providers to compete fairly. And that may take, and to make them compete fairly, it may take the form of regulation requiring certain actions, or it may be the result of judicial judgments focusing on illegal action. Second is equal humanity, equal minimum living standards for people. Everybody should have, for example, basic housing, basic food intake, and here we're talking about basic communications. And in some cases, having this connection to the broadband network could save people who are in need of immediate help in an emergency. Equal security is another social goal. And for example, you want to have protection from terrorist threats, from natural disasters, but you also want to have protection probably from the government or maybe from the government where there's an invasion of privacy. Equal opportunity. Everybody, if you have access to broadband services, it gives you access to jobs, to education. Equal citizenship. If you're online and you can access websites of the government, well, you're connected to the nation and you're part, and it's part of this idea of being equal as a public citizen. There are other fairness and equity motivations for universal broadband service that you hear less about, and that's social cohesion. Broadband can build communities, as some proponents say, especially in remote areas. Children should not be forced to leave small communities in rural areas for job opportunities. Older people should not have to leave because they need medical services. If they can get these online, if there's distance learning, telemedicine, then the communities can be kept together. And finally, I'll just use as a catch-all rent seeking. Sometimes players in the market want to make money and they disguise their incentives by couching them as in terms of social justice. If you help me, you help a society. So let's go on to some of the proposed solutions. So we're getting to the how-to. And there are two suggested methods of recourse. One is active intervention. And within active intervention, government intervention, there could be a focus on making the networks, the broadband network, more efficient. And how can you do that? Well, it turns out that, for example, rural communities are far away from internet backbone nodes where you access the internet. Well, if the government can cut these middle mile costs, that's what they're called, and improve geographic availability of these connections, well, you've improved the maybe not the efficiency, but at least the equity of the network. There's also fair interconnection. Suppose you have big network providers and small network providers. You want to make sure that the big network providers don't use their market power to shut out the small network providers. And I put down here an example is carrier quality Ethernet, where there's a high quality broadband service associated with Ethernet technology where it requires networks to work together to provide that high quality service. And it may turn out that certain networks may not want to connect with others. The government could intervene to make it fair interconnection a standard. Fair access to content and content delivery networks. Well, sometimes adoption of broadband service is linked to, let's say, being able to watch Hollywood quality videos. Well, if those are controlled by a few content providers and some transmission networks, well, some areas will be shut out from being able to provide broadband service to their customers. Finally, you want to have fair prices and arrangements for rural broadband provider initiated interconnection requests. Again, that's the idea that the small supplier of broadband services probably needs some protection against being either ignored or bullied by the bigger network providers, content providers, application providers, whatever you want to call them. Then there's a second part of active intervention. The first part was on the supply side. The second part is on the demand side and a customer approach. The government may want to have an enhanced link-up policy to get people who don't want to adopt or are afraid to adopt broadband services to use them. And for example, there's a program right now, Connect to Compete, where low-income customers can get a cheap computer and low-cost connection to the broadband network. Another possibility is to provide a lifeline service to buy down the cost of transmission for poor people on a continuing basis. So that's the active intervention, so on the supply side and on the demand side. But there are other people, policymakers, who say we don't need active intervention. Let the market solve it. The market is pretty robust, and if you wait a little bit, all problems will be solved. And when you talk about, let's just assume that active intervention is important. Again, we get to the idea of the scope of funding. As with all these fiscal programs, the question is who pays? and what's the scope of the solution? Should other industries like the electric power companies be considered when discussing broadband policies, because they're putting in uh, broadband networks for their own use, and they may be able to use them to provide traditional, let's say, internet service. And how is the government going to policies going to be funded? Should it be based on the number of broadband customers, based on their bills, or the number of connections, the types of connections? You could assess customers in many different ways of the telecommunications network, but you can also assess application providers based on sales volumes or revenues. There's no reason to assume that beneficiaries of, let's say, the internet, like Google, shouldn't be assessed, or at least the question of whether they should be assessed should be on the table. Now, let's go to the key players and their motivations, and I'll just list a few. There's CTIA, the Wireless Association. You can tell that this association of wireless companies would be in favor of, if there's any active government policy, well, wireless should get a piece of the funding, let's say. NCTA, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, would have a different viewpoint. They may say that uh, they've done well so far without any government programs, without any government fundings, and in fact, they're starting to compete with telecommunications carriers, and they're probably against funding telecommunications carriers to provide universal broadband service. Then there are big companies like AT&T and Verizon, who are big network providers, telecommunications carriers, and they have a carrier of last resort obligation to serve any customer within their territories, whether that customer is a moneymaker or not. And they would say that, look, if you want us to serve all the customers in our serving area, you need to help fund us. If not, then we don't want to be carriers of last resort. Google, I'm just picking Google out because it's so large, is an applications provider. Anything you see on the internet that you access is an application. It could be a combination of voice, data, and video. Well, they would want, their perspective is that they want to provide the intelligence and they want to assure the quality of services to their customers. They want the big network providers to give them just pipes to customers. They'll provide the intelligence uh, through server farms that have a lot of information on them, and through edge equipment like smartphones. And that's what they would like, is they want the big telecommunications providers to give them just free access to their pipes without anything else. Now, when you get to NTCA, not NCTA, National Telecommunications Cooperative Association, which is an association of small and rural telephone companies, well, they're serving customers out in remote locations. These are cooperatives. They're not even for-profit companies. They want government to help them provide services in areas that are where it's just not economically viable. And finally, other key player is the government at the federal, state, and local level. Let me just focus on the state. Each state would like to get some of the federal funding uh, to boost jobs and to modernize the economy. The same with local government. So those are the players, and let me dig a little bit deeper and see if we can just categorize the influences on the players, both in the private sector and in the public sector. First of all, from an economic perspective, each of these players is a rent seeker. They're looking for profits if they're a private company, or they're looking for jobs if it's a government, for example, jobs in a particular state. A company's size in the private sector will have a bearing on how the company views the market. Large publicly traded carriers are focus on profits. They have to show every year positive increases in profits to see their stock prices go up. Whereas small carriers, especially those cooperatives, have multiple goals that are blurred. Sure, a rural cooperative wants to earn profits and give it back to its customers, but the cooperatives are also associated with community building, keeping the people together. The providers of those telecommunications networks in rural areas live in the community and know their neighbors. The next is you have to always consider in the private sector the market edge. Every company in the private sector really dreams about being a monopolist, especially if they have a product or technological edge. If they don't have any edges and they can't be a monopoly, well, they want to tap into an established firm and siphon profits. And small players have a great incentive to want to interconnect with bigger ones to improve their scope, and better yet, for free. Another economic influence that shouldn't be ignored, in fact is very important, is legacy government programs. The government has funded universal service in the past and has subcontracted that universal service obligation to telecommunications carriers, and they've accepted these funds, built out with good intentions, and now depend on government support. If that support is taken away, they could be in financial difficulties. So that's an important issue in reform, legacy programs. Now I want to get into some of the hidden influences. Those are the overt ones that everybody talks about, but I'd like to look at it from a different perspective now. And I believe that training and background, especially people who've gone to college and to graduate school, have an extremely important effect on people's attitudes, policymakers' attitudes towards planning versus the market, active planning versus the market. And let me give you a little bit of background. So although this is one bullet here, belief in free market versus active role of the government, in fact, I'm going to go into it in a lot of detail for about 3 or 4 minutes. First of all, the timing of when people were trained who are policymakers is extremely important. During the Depression until the 1970s, one type of economic theory held sway, and it was basically that individuals are myopic and self-centered, which sometimes leads to very bad results, like a run on a bank. And the government, especially in the 30s and 40s and 50s, the government was seen as far-seeing and altruistic. And the government could solve these kind of problems. For example, to prevent runs on banks, the government introduced federal deposit insurance. And to make sure that banks operated with a certain degree of caution, there were limits on banking lending policies. the key intellectuals that started this basic activist government policy were, of course, for those who've taken economics, Keynes is the major figure, but there are other ones that you ought to get familiar with. There was Adolf Berle and Gardner Means, who actually, I think it was in the 30s, also suggested, may have been 40s, also suggested that corporate executives are not restrained by stockholders, and they're basically out for themselves, and you have to watch out. And then since the Great Recession that we're still in the midst of, another economist that was kind of marginalized for many years, and now after his death has become a major figure, is Hyman Minsky, who documented the herd mentality of private actors who are self-centered and myopic, and their herd mentality leads to speculative bubbles that burst and cause great recessions. So that's one type of view of economic theory and government and a justification for active government intervention. And certainly some of the people who were trained in the 1970s who affected policy in the 1990s were under this influence. Then in the 1970s, through the beginning of the Great Recession, there was another view of economic theory that became ascendant. And there, in this model, the individual, again, is myopic and self-centered, but also creative, and that's good. The person is out for himself and creates to get an edge in the market. And this not only leads to creativity, but it leads to increased freedom. And from this tradition, government officials are not altruistic and far-seeing. They're actually myopic and self-centered. They want to make names for themselves. They want to pay off the people who supported them. They believe in bold strokes, big programs with their names on it. And this tends to cause government size to increase. It leads to highly regulated industries, and it leads to government deficits. And the key intellectuals behind this, at the beginning, I suppose, is Adam Smith. The second one is from a popular perspective, is Milton Friedman. I think he did as much to change policy towards deregulation and free competition than anyone after World War II. And he probably influenced Reagan and Thatcher. And he said that keep government small, deregulate, and if you need to have a government program, have it operate by rules that require very little bureaucratic influence. And besides Milton Friedman, the other major figures are Friedrich Hayek. The Road to Serfdom is his classic book. And, of course, the novelist who turned this type of approach to individuals self-centered and myopic into almost a religion is Ayn Rand, who thought that any government intervention is bad. Besides this training, if the people have gone to college and to graduate school, who've come from these traditions, have also learned techniques, and basically statistical techniques, quantitative techniques, and even the ones that are for free markets often fall into a love affair with modeling. And I remember in the 1970s, this one really stuck with me. I remember just after Kenneth Arrow won the Nobel Prize, he spoke at Columbia, where he got his PhD, and I was getting my PhD. He said the Soviet Union would overtake the United States because it had a central planning model and produced more accurate future prices. So he was in love with modeling, and he's not the only notable person. If you search the literature, you'll find that famous Nobel Prize winners believed in models, and that led to financial meltdowns. People have developed simulation models that have predicted global environmental disasters and running out of oil every decade since the 1970s. And eventually they may be right, but it's interesting that these two, both what I would call the liberal economists, the activists, and the libertarian, the market-based economists, and the people who support it, both like to use fancy techniques. Now, there's a third type of political philosophy that affects policy that you ought to be aware of, and those are the conservatives. And they're not the liberals and the libertarians, but they focus on community instead of the myopic individual. They don't want to raise myopic, self-centered individuals. They want to raise gentlemen and ladies that focus on community and community obligations. And they want public policy to strengthen communities. And some of the intellectuals from that political philosophy are Edmund Burke from England, Alex de Tocqueville, a Frenchman who came to the United States and examined how American society works. And instead of picking out more familiar conservatives from the last few decades, I'm going to pick out somebody that is not well known by the public. And I think he's the best representative of the conservative tradition that I've read recently. And his name is John Bogle. He's the founder of Vanguard Corporation that has the mutual funds. And I don't pick him out simply because he's a Princeton graduate, and my son's graduated from Princeton, and this course is being sponsored by Princeton. It's because I truly believe that people ought to read some of his writings because they're really in this tradition of Edmund Burke, and quite important to read. So you need to understand the training and background of the policymakers to really understand where they're coming from. You would expect that policymakers who are younger right now are going to emphasize free market practically at the expense of any other goal in solving the broadband availability problem. Now I want to focus on another hidden influence, and that's technology. And my viewpoint is going to be almost Marxian in the sense that technology influences the way people view the world, the economy, economic relationships. And there are three views of the broadband market. Well, actually, of networks. One is the traditional view of the telecommunications network, uniform voice service. The network was intelligent, and the edge equipment, the phones, were dumb. The more popular view of technology right now is, I'll call it the modern view of technology. It's associated with the internet, where the edge equipment, the smart devices, the iPads, the iPhones, are intelligent, the network is dumb, and the services are diverse. And then I'm going to put another technological change that's occurring that isn't popular and hasn't been discussed as much as it should be, and I'll call it the postmodern, where both the network, edge equipment are intelligent, other overlapping intelligent networks are evolving, especially content delivery networks and cloud computing. Content delivery networks, think of them as delivering video service. Cloud computing, instead of using your own PC, you compute using uh, servers that are remote from you. Now, this perspective, this technology perspective, depends on what type of company you're working for. For example, I mentioned to you that Google would focus on the modern network. It wants the edge equipment to be intelligent, the content delivery, its own network to be intelligent, but it wants the telecommunications network to be dumb. Now, if you're at Verizon, well, you have another viewpoint. You want the network to be intelligent and to assist and complement the edge equipment and and be publicly available intelligence to smaller companies, not necessarily Google. So those are going to affect your perceptions, where you are in that space, in the broadband space. So as I go along to develop your informed opinions, I'll try to discuss some direct evidence on each perspective. I'll look at, and how will I do that? I'll look at regulatory initiatives and results. I'll look at market trends and performance. Besides the direct evidence, I'll try to bring in some collateral evidence. And because this is such a short course, unfortunately, I'll only be able to discuss them tangentially. Talk about the wireless experience to some extent, the electric power experience. Unfortunately, I'll just mention it in passing. The internet, I will discuss, and the postal service, which I would like to get to, but probably won't. I may mention it in passing. So this is the last slide for section 1, and it just gives you a preview of what we'll be talking about in the next 4 sections. I'll be talking about regulatory history and proposals. I'll look at market evolution and recent trends. And I'll give you a personal assessment of regulatory initiatives and give you my own recommendations at the end.